Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 70. As we approach the holiday season and I get to the big 7-0, I'm hoping that you guys really like what's been going on. We're wrapping up, central to our second year here on the Podcast Digest. And I'm hearing from a lot of you that you guys have been really enjoying what's been going on. And I really appreciate it. A lot of positive feedback. I've tried a few different things this year. And, I had that recent episode with Harry Duran from Podcast Junkies where, you guys got to hear a lot more about me. I hope you guys enjoyed that. But that was a one-off, and now I'm turning the spotlight back on another great guest. I have said all along, folks, and I've not done a great job at this. I'll be the first one to admit that for sure, but that I want to feature shows big and small with big name recognition, but those that I also think need to be more recognized. And I've tried to do that all along. I did a little bit better job at that early on, but I promise I'm not going to lose that focus. I'm bringing back a guest for this week's episode. Those of you with the show notes or with the title of the episode already know who I'm talking about. But I believe, and I was trying to run through in my mind, my first ever third appearance on the Podcast Digest in these 70 episodes. I started first with my first ever interview back on January 4th of this year, 2015, and it was two guests way back then on episode 19, and then one of my earliest first recommendation episodes where I started bringing on what I call my co-hosts when we talk about great podcasts. So I was reaching out to other podcast hosts or writers or website, podcast reviewers. And that was episode 28, and that was March 8th of this year, where I did a recommendation show with this gentleman. And this is his first appearance back on the Podcast Digest from episode 28 now to episode 70. And it is my pleasure to welcome back the one and only Diamond Dave Maier. Dave, welcome back to the Podcast Digest.
Oh, thanks for having me again, Dan. And it's always a good day when I get to sit down and talk to you again. I've been really looking forward to this all day.
Yeah, man, and I've been looking forward to having you back on like we were talking about before I hit the record. It's something that I always wanted to do again after our last time. You and your colleague from almost a year ago now were so kind to give me some of your time as my first ever other podcaster guest back on episode 19, and it really sort of set the tone for me moving forward. So I've always felt indebted to Dave Meyer and his troupe of fellow podcasters. And there's a lot been going on with you throughout 2015, and that's really why I wanted to have you back on, to kind of talk about your year and talk about some new ventures you've got. But before we get there, for any strange reason, anybody who's recently come to the Podcast Digest in these last couple of months maybe hasn't heard from you before in your previous appearance. Tell folks a little bit about yourself, your background, maybe a little bit prior to picking up a microphone. Who is Dave Meyer?
Well, I was very lucky enough to be invited by you on the show a year ago. And what's also interesting is from how much I podcasted, I still get nervous talking to you, and I don't know why.
Weird.
It must be your voice, which I'll bring up again because you do have that awesome voice. But about a year ago, me and some friends thought it'd be fun to just sit down with the mic and start recording because we thought people might think we're funny. And that lasted about a year. We kind of fell apart, and I discovered through that I just love podcasting. So me and one of my other co-hosts, Aaron, broke off from the Cool Story Show, and we created Podcast Without Borders, which is a very loose interview show where we talk to guests, and that's been going strong for a year now. It's one of my primary projects. And then my dad got really big into it, and I started a podcast with my father called Diamond Minds. And then recently I've created kind of a brand new adventure that I'm extremely excited for called Chronicles Unwritten, which is a new story-based podcast. And that's kind of my little quick catalog in a flash.
But before you ever started Cool Story Show, tell folks a little bit about you. You are up in the Great White North, right?
I am in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, obviously. It is pretty cold right now. It's around minus 5 degrees. And I don't really know what else to say about myself. I enjoy reading, playing games, and just going on crazy adventures.
And not married, no kids. And in fact, the dating life is a favorite topic of Podcasts Without Borders and Diamond Minds and such, right?
Yeah, I like to venture on the dating sites and kind of give updates as I go through it. And I don't know, maybe I might have a date coming up soon, so we'll see.
These are the recent stories for subscribers of the show. I'm sure they continually tune in to hear how the ventures of Dave Meier's dating life is going on.
Well, hopefully.
Yeah. So, Cool Story Show. That is how I first ever came across you. And I look back, and I might even have to listen back to episode 19 to even remind myself how I first found it. But when I first found it, I really liked what you guys had going on. And you know what's interesting is there's another show, another independent show that you and I are huge fans of and we know and love, which is Couple Things.
Oh, Couple Things podcast. I love that show.
And what's interesting about that is there was kind of sort of a connection between those two shows in my mind, in the sense that it is 4 hosts and it's generally topical, right? And that's different than a little bit different than Podcasts Without Borders, maybe even a little bit different than Diamond Mines, and a little different than a lot of the shows out there at this point in terms of conversational podcasts. When you guys started Cool Story Show, what were you guys as a group? Because none of you had any experience at that point as podcast hosts, correct?
That's correct.
So how did you guys put that together? What was the thought process behind starting that show, choosing its format, having its rigidity as opposed to just turn on the mics and talk?
Well, I think a lot of us had listened to podcasts, and I think that's one of the reasons why I love Couple Things so much, is because it really is what we kind of dreamed Cool Story Show to be. And that was that because we had, 4 guys, we decided that to make it unique, we just each bring a topic to the table, and we'd talk about it for an hour. Because you can talk about, you can pick any topic you want and have a conversation about it. And we were all close friends, and you could just literally just talk about anything. And like I said, that's why I really liked Couple Things, because that's what I wanted it to become. But the thing is when you have, multiple co-hosts, sometimes it just doesn't click, and people want to do things in different directions. And like I said, I just had to let it go, unfortunately. But it was a really fun time I got to have with them.
Yeah, and Cool Story Show, I think, while I don't know that necessarily quote unquote ended well, and I don't want to rehash that story because you've talked about it on several other shows. Yeah. Fans of Dave Meyer and company, they already know that story, so I don't want to necessarily go over that. But looking back, Cool Story Show will always, I'm going to assume here, always hold a special place in your heart, because that started the mascot. That was your intro to podcasting, and a co-host of a current show came out of that, correct?
Yeah. I mean, if we wouldn't have done the Cool Story Show, I wouldn't be podcasting now, plain and simple. I wouldn't have fallen in love with this beautiful hobby and been able to meet so many cool people and be sitting here right now talking to you. So it'll always be, special in the back of my, my mind and heart.
And the one I'm referring to, Dave Meyer's sidekick is what I call him, the immoral bastard, Aaron Corbet. I had to get that in because I know he's going to hear this, and if I didn't call him out with my assigned nickname to him, I feel like I wouldn't be doing my job.
I don't think anyone's called him that in a while, actually.
Yeah, well, I've heard you guys bring it up. It's been a couple of months, but I'm trying to reinvigorate that, because people who listen to Podcasts Without Borders probably feel the same.
Yeah, I got to get those T-shirts made too. So
yeah, folks who are not current Podcasts Without Borders subscribers, though, tell a little bit about your co-host, your friend Aaron.
My friend Aaron is, I would describe, the complete opposite of me. He's very loud. He's very charming. He's very creative. And when we started doing Podcasts Without Borders, I thought it'd be interesting to have him in the mix, because he's, like I said, we're 2 different sides of the coin. So when we can sit down and talk to people, you get it from 2 different directions. And that's what I really hope carries the conversation and the flow of it. But it's just an excuse really for me to sit down with one of my best friends and just have a conversation with so many cool people from all over the world. And, I really don't see myself doing that show with anybody else, because he's a really good friend. He's a good conversationalist, and he is an immoral bastard.
And you guys are a number of episodes in now. It is your longest running show?
My longest running show. I think it's almost at 50.
There you go. And tell folks, what has that experience been like, podcasting with a friend, somebody so different, and what's the reception been like to it? What's the feedback from listeners? What has this road been like for you?
It's been a very enjoyable road. We get to talk to, obviously, a lot of people, and a lot of those people I've been fortunate enough to call my friends. I actually got to meet a lot of the podcasters that we've had on as guests in Portland over the summer. And I think it's brought Aaron and I closer. And it's just really, really nice, like I said, to just sit down with your best friend and just have a conversation with somebody. I definitely think it's helped kind of step my way into other shows and creative podcasts. But I definitely say it's definitely like a stepping stone for me to keep getting out there in the podcasting world and just keep doing this.
And you guys have had a huge range of guests, right? You've had everything from personal non-podcasting friends to all the way up to Libsyn executives and everything in between, right?
Well, the title really says it all. Like there is no borders to who we want to talk to, what we want to talk about. And, we'll talk to anybody, be it like, it probably never happened, but, talking to President Obama, it could be like just some guy we met out on the street. It could be one of our best friends. We just legitimately want to have, I say stranger conversations, but you know what I mean? Like we want to have complete conversations with strangers almost, if we can. But most of the time it's usually with people that we've been talking to or interacting on Twitter. But it's fun. It's really fun premise, like I said, just to sit down and chat with these people.
And what has the feedback been from people who've listened, people who've engaged with the show? What do people think of it?
I think people like it. I mean, it's always interesting when you put a show out. You're always like, hoping to get responses and feedback. We have a lot of dedicated fans that follow us every week, never miss an episode, live tweet, and that's just really heartwarming that they do that. We do get quite a few emails because Aaron tends to go off topic, where I'll go unhinged and be a bit immoral. But that always brings for interesting conversation. And, it's always good to get some feedback than no feedback. But for the most part, I think people really like it.
It's been an interesting road. I've heard probably 95% of the shows. I will own up to missing one or two. My subscription list has gone crazy at a time or two. But overwhelmingly, I've heard them all. And it is... you and Aaron do have that, that back and forth, that interaction, that playing off each other. That is that oil and water, or that difference of opinion so often that I think is certainly entertaining and enjoyable for sure.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that.
So, Diamond Mines, how in the world did that come to be? That is the show with your dad.
It is. Diamond Mines came to be because after 6 or 8 months of podcasting, my dad finally, I guess, decided to take interest in one of my hobbies, and he listened to one of my shows. And he said he was really blown away that it was like he was sitting in a room listening and having a conversation with me being there, because my family lives in Texas. I live in Canada, so we don't really get to talk that much. So he goes through binging a bunch of shows. I know he listens to your show and a bunch of others. And he's like, well, why don't we do a show? And I was like, yeah, let's do a show. And I think you even came up with a title originally for that show when I was kind of tweeting out and saying, like, should we do this? And that was awesome to get this whole family dynamic involved. Because, I mean, we've had my sister, we've had my mom, we've had my uncle, we've had my uncle, who I would never think of would ever get onto a mic and talk to us. And it's just really nice to sit down and have a conversation and catch up with my dad, be it, talking about different things from a generation gap, or sharing jokes, or even we more or less bring guests on, rotating them every other week. But it's just a really nice time to sit down and catch up with my father and podcast. It's just unbelievable.
And it's a dynamic that I don't know is out there a whole bunch. There are a few other father-son podcasts, but oftentimes they are taken from like adult father and like super young child. A lot of those like exposed to movies I watched when I was young. Now I'm going to have my 12-year-old watch it too. Or you see a lot of podcasts now where, hey, I'm going to get my 9-year-old who likes to talk on a microphone on there. I don't know about two adults coupling together a show and hearing their perspective on things. I'm not sure there is another one, or at least not one I'm familiar of. So I think Diamond Mines definitely offers something very unique in terms of a listening experience. And I'll say this, for Paul, your dad, Triple D, as you affectionately labeled, Diamond Dave's dad, just being, trying to be, objective just for a quick second. I think he's gotten a lot better over these months. Have you ever had that thought or even that conversation with him? I think he is, especially when you guys do have guests, he's almost kind of honed his interview and conversational skills. He's really kind of upped his game, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah. He's just leaps and bounds. I mean, there'll be episodes where he'll text me after and be like, hey, you didn't say a lot that episode. And I'll be like, yeah, because you were killing it. Yeah. And it's funny because I can't tell if my mom's getting mad at him, but he's completely taken over the office in the house and turned it into like a podcast studio.
That's great.
And I think it's hilarious that he's really gone heavy into this hobby to where he's kind of made it his own and him and my cousin actually just branched off and made their own show. I think it's called One Liner Notes, and it's even interesting to see him pursue more than just this one that we're doing and falling in love with the hobby, just like me. It's almost like a dynasty.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I don't want to be unclear. I'm not saying that he was never great to listen to, but I think at first there was novelty, but then after a while it was like he kind of stepped up and became like 50% of the show, like a real co-host, and he's doing an excellent job, especially in recent weeks and months, and just my compliments to Mr. Meyer.
Absolutely, I'm very proud of him. He's he really is doing an amazing job, and I always look forward to podcasting with him every week.
And similarly, I'm really anxious to hear, because I've not talked to you in a recording setting like we are right now about Diamond Mines and its reception, because there was a lot of buzz. I at least my Twitter timeline. And folks, if you're not following, Dave or his dad or the shows we've been talking about, Podcasts Without Borders or Diamond Mines, all these links will be in the show notes, as they always are, folks, right? You know that line from me at this point. But there seemed to be a lot of buzz about it and a lot of great positive reception from being one half of the show. What was it like as you guys launched this and got more and more episodes in?
Well, you get tweets and stuff like, oh, this was funny, oh, this was great. But we've legitimately gotten emails from people saying like, hey, I think it's really touching that you and your father have sat down and had a conversation. I reached out to my father and we've been actually talking more. We had one girl email us and say like, my dad telling a story about how he went back to school inspired her to go back to school. And like, that stuff just blows my mind, because we're literally just sitting down and having a conversation, and through people listening to it, it's kind of inspiring them to do things. So it's kind of like an unexpected joy that you get out of this, where it causes other people to do things. A family that listened to our show actually started their own podcast too. And even that's flattering. It's just like somebody tunes in, hears what you're doing, and then wants to go pursue that. So it's kind of different scales. Like every podcast I try to get involved with is a different level of myself. And it, like I said, I wouldn't trade anything in the world to not keep doing this with my dad, because he's just incredible. And the show is fantastic.
And you said different levels of yourself, or I maybe use the word versions of yourself, and that's going to segue next into the next venture that I would definitely want to get into. But compare and contrast for me, Dave. Podcasts Without Borders and Diamond Mines are, in so many ways, two completely different shows. Maybe they share a few similarities. I mean, you being one, and maybe some sense of humor stuff in there, but completely different dynamics, sort of rhythms to the show. They're very different. What's that been like for you to kind of take one hat off and put another one on in terms of recording these shows?
Well, it's just different sides. Like my dad often will ask me like, if you had to drop one, which would you pick? And I tell him like I wouldn't drop either or, because the side with Podcasts Without Borders is kind of me, just being fun and having conversations and being silly and joking around. But then when you flip it over to Mines, I get to talk to my dad about deep stuff, learn more about what he went through, and talk about different things between us, and it's rebuilding a friendship again with my dad, because like I said, we don't live anywhere close to each other, and it's not really me switching back and forth between different personalities. It's just getting to express different personalities, I guess, two different ways.
I just had a really overly deep, overly sappy thought, but I'm going to share it, because I bet somebody out there maybe have had the same thought listening to Dave Meyer on these two different shows. But Podcasts Without Borders is almost like you're slowly in the process of turning a friend into a family member, whereas Diamond Mines is like you're turning a family member into a friend.
Ooh, that's deep, man.
I know it's deep, but it kind of fits, right? I mean, is that too much? Is that too syrupy? Does that not work, or am I onto something there?
I like that. I have to say that's absolutely 100% correct.
Yeah, I think so, and it's funny because it is like you said, and what's interesting is both your co-hosts bring completely different elements to the table. I don't know that there's many similarities between Paul Maier and Aaron Corbet, but I will say this: they are both great storytellers. And when Aaron Corbet gets in his mode on Podcasts Without Borders with a story, me as a listener, and I imagine a lot of other folks listening to this conversation, are super intrigued and entertained. But the same could be said for your dad, Paul, as well. I know one that sticks right in my mind and one that I always remember, and I still think about it when I walk through a Lowe's or Home Depot, is his door replacement story.
The glass door.
The glass door. He told that story in a way that was so relatable and so I felt so bad for him, and the concept that he got so frustrated and he's just like, I need a drink, you know. And I'm thinking to myself, I've had that experience, maybe not necessarily with a glass door, but trying to do something and be like, you know what, screw it, I need a drink at this point.
Yeah, and Dad's a very strong-willed person. Like he's very smart, and if he wants to do something, he'll do it, and he'll figure out how to do it. And to have a glass door shatter on him, just obviously because of the blow that it was from it exploding, but just like seeing this project that he was having to do crumbled in an instant was just like So,
and that's a great episode. I wish I'd had that ready at the ready, but folks, I don't think it matters. Subscribe to Diamond Minds if you're already not, and just start from the beginning and go on through, and you'll hear a couple of things I've just talked about. One, I think the evolution of Paul Maier as a co-host, I mean, he's really a pro now, in my opinion. But also, you'll come across that Glassdoor story, which is a story worth hearing. If any of you have ever tried any at-home project and just struggled with it and ultimately been pseudo-defeated by it, you'll appreciate Paul Maier's story of the glass door. It's entertaining to say the least, and it's good to see that he can at least laugh about it now.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've got these two versions of Dave. We've got, to use my overly syrupy one, you've got one with your friend, one with your family, and all the work that you're putting out there and what people's reception have been to these show. But you had an itch to even go beyond that. You've become prolific podcaster. So ventures beyond those two shows. What have you been doing now?
Well, I don't want to say I wanted more, but I wanted to do something creatively, because like I'm a writer. I like to write stories. I like to think of stories. I like to keep doing things that are creative. And even though podcasting is sort of creative, I didn't really feel like I was flexing any muscle or doing anything creative, so to speak. And I was talking to Tristan from an archaeologist, and we were swapping back ideas about stories. And I said, oh, it'd be a cool idea if we were to do a podcast where like I'd write a story, then I'd pass it over to you, and then you'd keep writing it. And then we went back and forth, and, we'd essentially write the story together. And that idea kind of died. But what I'm hoping, if you remember, is I don't remember how my new podcast, Unwritten Chronicles, came about. I think it was a Twitter conversation between you, me, Carl, and my cousin that kind of made it take off, or made me just like spark it and say like, should I do this? Because I don't remember.
Well, my recollection of that was I saw a tweet that said something about your roommate challenged you to write 50,000 words in the month of November.
That was it.
Something to that effect. And I responded, yes, do it and make it a podcast.
That was it. Yes. Because my roommate was doing NaNoWriMo, National Writing Novel Month or something.
Right.
And he said, you should do it. And I thought to myself, well, there's no way I could write. I think it's something crazy like 15,000 words or something, maybe 50,000 words, because with all the projects I have. So I was like, well, instead of doing that, why don't we just turn it into a podcast? And I did.
And then it became a special version of a podcast. Tell folks the difference with Chronicles Unwritten that you're going for here.
Well, I think every podcaster usually goes two ways. They either pick up a mic and they try to be like somebody they've heard, or they try to do something different because you want to stand out. And my way of trying to stand out is I thought of this podcast where I would begin writing a story, and then at the end of each, I use the word chapter, but at the end of each kind of part or chapter, I give the audience two choices, and then they get to decide which direction the story goes to next, to where part after part, you build this story together through their choosing. And I thought that was a really cool, really unique idea that no one's ever done before. So I had to go with it.
So it's like a modified choose your own adventure podcast.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. And like, as I'm going to do different seasons, I'm going to, at the end of season 1, I'm going to say, what do you want me to write next? Horror, sci-fi, anything, except for maybe romance or comedy. I don't think I could write those two.
So this episode is episode 70. This is going to be released to the world, and happy, super Podcast Digest listeners are hearing this on the 13th. Let's see, I'm trying to get my date straight. Yes, the 13th of December. But as we sit here and record this, this is December 10th. Tell folks where Chronicles Unwritten stands today.
I've released episode 1. It's available now. And I finally ended the voting, I think, earlier this week.
Whoa, explain to folks what voting is.
Okay, so like I said, at the end of the episode, like I said, you have 2 choices, basically. So what I do is I kind of give people, I decided maybe, I'm still kind of working out the kinks, but I think either a week or a week and a half to listen to it and get the votes in. Because the problem is like it does take a while to write, and then I have to send it to my, to my friend Tristan to record, and that takes some time. So you don't want to leave it too long, because then you're pushing maybe, 2 to 3 to 4 weeks between episodes, but you want to try to keep it, as close as possible to when it, originally released. So what I decided is you could either tweet at me what you think the results of the choices should be, or on the official close date, I release a Twitter poll, and then you can vote that way. And then I basically tally it all up and write it from there.
And this is at Chronicles U, is the Chronicles Unwritten Twitter handle, and that is where the voting will be happening at the end of each chapter?
That is correct.
And you mentioned Tristan. Some people listening to this and may not be familiar with him. Tell folks a little bit about your voice artist, if you will.
Tristan Boyle. Tristan is host of An Archaeologist, and I forget how I met him. I think it was either through Instagram or Twitter, but we instantly connected. Like he's been one of my good friends, and I've really enjoyed talking to him. And the reason why I wanted to do the show with him is because he's really got a creative story side that I just adore, and he has one of the best voices besides yourself in the business so far.
Oh, I'll take his voice over mine any day, Dave. He's got an accent. I don't offer that.
Like the guy, because when I originally wanted to do this, I thought about narrating myself, because obviously when you try to put more people into the mix, it gets kind of hard to try to schedule everything and get everything back to put it together. But I kind of suffer from that thing that most podcasters do, where I don't necessarily have confidence in my voice for narrating. So I decided to see if he wanted to do it, and he loved the idea, and he said yes. And I would agree that it really makes the story pop. Like that's one element of season 1 that I love, is just like he adds so much to the story that it really brings it to life.
So you mentioned you're still kind of figuring out all the details and things like that. If you're willing, tell folks a little bit about sort of what this design process was in terms of choosing to write, the feedback, the polls, the vote, having Tristan. What were some of the kind of the decision making that kind of went into everything folks are hearing so far?
Well, it's obviously you have to pick a genre. So for season 1, I picked fantasy, because fantasy is always my biggest love. And then, when you're trying to figure out how to make choices, you have to kind of write the story to where it leads to a choice. And that can sometimes be difficult, but I've got some really cool things planned based on the choices that people make that are just going to blow people away. It's so creatively cool. Oh man. As far as like the poll goes, I kind of struggled with this a bit, and I was talking to Agent Palmer about it, and we kind of agreed that yes, let people kind of tweet it in, but do like an official poll to end it officially, so that like, say as you're writing too, you don't get people sending tweets and saying, hey, you should do this or that. That way it kind of gives them a guided timeline that they need to follow to get the vote in. And then as far as like the rest of the show goes, I literally write it. I get my roommate to kind of pre-read it, in the sense that, sometimes when you write stuff, you write it down, but it might not make sense in certain parts. So he'll correct that, and then he'll give it back to me. And then I send it over to somebody for editing, which is Agent Palmer. And then I send it off to Tristan. And I got to tell you, like when he sends the audio back, there are some hilarious outtakes that I'm going to be posting at the end of the season. Because you know how sometimes when you talk, things don't come out right. But he's got some really hilarious parts that I'm gonna include in a bonus episode. And then once that's done, I just kind of slice it all together, add some guitar music, and post it out.
Nice. So are you able to project at this point, or are we too early in the process? How many chapters or episodes are we looking at for season 1?
It's a little too early. I have kind of a start, a middle, and an end in mind. And I think one of the things that you and I had originally talked about was kind of like pre-writing chapters out and get like the ball rolling. But one thing I kind of wanted to do on top of this was to kind of challenge myself. Instead of writing it all down, I'd like to write something, see where people want to go, and then kind of build on that instead of kind of pre-writing it. So that's pretty much it.
Well, do you think we're talking 8 to 10, 15 to 20, or is it not even reasonable to even guess at this point?
I don't think it'll be 20. I guess if I had to guess, it would be maybe 12 to 15.
Right.
But it all depends on like on writing stuff out.
So let me.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, let me ask you this question, because somebody, a Dave Meyer fan listening to this right now, wants me to ask this. I can feel it in my head. You mentioned Tristan doing the narration, and he is killing it, right? It sort of reminds me of Audible, right? In a sense that this is almost like an audiobook, in a sense of listening to his narration. And although Tristan steps it up big time with sort of his version of voicing characters, if you will, and he does a phenomenal job. Have you ever considered maybe interjecting yourself as a voice of a character?
Oh, absolutely. And I've already had people ask me like, hey, can you make me a character? And
right.
I'm completely open to the idea, to be honest. It then becomes more of a radio play. Right. But I think what some people need to realize is like, if you commit to a character, you have to keep doing it until the season's done.
Right.
That's why I kind of I try to keep these episodes short. They're going to be roughly 10 to 15 minutes. Because, you know, it's also hard to kind of ask somebody, it's like, here, take the script, read it without getting paid, and then send it back to me. So I don't want to really overburden anybody, but I've also kind of had the idea where each season will have a different narrator. So like if Tristan did like say, hey, this was awesome, I want to do it again, I'll be like, hey, great, let's add these other voices into the mix. Or if he's like, you know what, that was really good, but like I have to take a break, I can say, okay, well, let's see who else wants to do this.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of previous guests here on the Podcast Digest. The biggest name when I talk with Jason Snell, he's also got the Incomparable Network, and they have recently launched or focused in on the Incomparable Radio Theater, which is a lot of sort of fantasy sci-fi, and there's 8 to 10 to 12 characters, and that is a super edit effort. I know Jason's written about it on his website, Six Colors, but more in the independent scene. You've got, of course, good friends of the show over at Shark Dropper Studios doing multiple shows like Doppel Avenue Hurt and Paralyzed and these kind of fictional acted out radio dramas, if you will, and even recent guests, the Mo Show. I mean, the Mo Show in terms of comedy, and those are professional voiceover artists that are just really killing it. It just makes me think there's a lot of interest in this idea of fictional radio style acted out written scripted entertainment, and it's interesting. None of those that I just mentioned is doing the concept of listener interaction for where the story goes next. So I think personally you're really onto something. Have you heard some of those other ones that I just mentioned and gotten any ideas from them?
I haven't, but there's another one. I think I'm going to butcher their name. I think it's Once Upon a Future Nerd or something.
Okay.
But they do kind of a story podcast, but I really like the idea of this being like, an audiobook. It's something different that you can kind of plug in and you can follow along the adventure. And when I complete all the parts, I'm going to take those all and I'm going to splice them together and I'm going to make a complete episode that people can download. And then it's almost like a completed little book, because I think everybody wants to be part of a story or is thinking of a story. And this is my way of kind of like letting everyone do that in some sort of way.
So you mentioned potentially other genres, future seasons. Can you share with folks, and again, you're very early on in the first season, but maybe some other ideas you've got in the back of your head for future season? Will there be a break, I would assume, between season 1 and season 2?
There may be. Well, I guess I'll have to deal with that when I get there, but I'm always writing stories in my head, so I've got a few horror ones planned. Like There's a small little mining town, kind of maybe set in the 90s, where they're kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and nobody's heard from the people there in a while. And these two officers go to investigate, and the town's completely empty. And you have to find out what happens. But that's kind of my way of playing with horror. I've got kind of sci-fi ones. Tristan and I have talked about doing one about corporations going out into the galaxy and mining stuff dry, and then you've got these smaller corporations coming in and them kind of fighting over it. But there's so many stories you could write, so many directions, and I want to write them all. Seriously, I want people to say like, "Hey, try writing this," and I'll do it. I'll give anything a legitimate shot once, except for romance.
Yeah. I don't know. Going back to the dating exploits that you're chronicling on Podcasts Without Borders, Diamond Mines, etc. Maybe a story idea will come, someday.
You know what? I say no romance, but I'll try it. Yeah. I'll try anything once. I don't know if it would be any good, but it would definitely be an experience. That's for sure.
You mentioned that this is kind of your passion project, if you will, or one that you have a lot of investment in. Maybe not, I don't want to say more so than Diamond Mines or Podcasts Without Borders, but certainly a different effort and energy to it. Can you tell us why? I mean, why do you think that you've sort of jumped on this idea and bred an enthusiasm for it a little bit different than your other ventures?
Well, I think first and foremost is it's me kind of trying to go out on my own. I do Podcasts Without Borders with Cole and Aaron. I do Diamond Mines with Dad, and this one Tristan is a partner with for me. But it's kind of my own podcast. It's my own adventure that I get to throw out into the world and say like, okay, this is all on me. I'm doing all of this, and I really want to see what this can come of it. But I love being creative, and like I said, trying to write something that hopefully people enjoy and seeing what they get out of it. Because anybody can sit down and have a conversation with somebody, but if you can sit down and write a story and make people fall in love with it and try to be part of it, I think that's just something special.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that you're on to something, and it is definitely something special. And it's a prime reason that I really wanted to have you back on the Podcast Digest, because I really want folks to give this a shot, to listen to the writing that you're putting out there, and to Tristan's wonderful narration on the first episode, and to get involved with the polls and what have you. And folks, I mentioned some of those other previous episodes and guests that I've had, that if you've checked out any of those shows that I mentioned, be it from Jason Snell and the Incomparable Radio Theater, or from Shark Dropper and Doppel Avenue Hurt or Paralyzed, or even most recently, The Mo Show, this is right up your alley in terms of the fictionalized podcast, and even going even more mainstream and more recent. If you've gotten into The Message from GE Podcast Theater, the Message has taken off, as well as Limetown, right? These are all fictionalized, but Black Tapes, the Black Tapes podcast. These are all fictionalized story serialized shows, except the difference between all of those shows and Chronicles Unwritten is that you don't have a vote. This one you do.
And maybe something happens where somebody will change the complete. Like my roommate was joking, he's like, "You should make a choice that ends the season after 2 episodes." And I'd be like, "Well, that could be really funny, but I don't know if people would like that." But I am going to introduce some very interesting elements that all have repercussions to them in some way, shape, or form.
So that's reason to subscribe and check it out. And like Dave said, folks, they're short, right? I mean, these are not giant time commitments or something that's going to be in your feed every single day for an hour. It's worth checking out, and it's worth seeing what Dave is putting together. And I really hope that you folks will take a moment. Link in the show notes. Check out Chronicles Unwritten. I think it's something I was I felt very privileged by Dave. He shared with me the first episode in advance of its release, and I just loved it. I thought that this is something that somebody like me, and probably like many of you listening, if you're a subscriber to the Podcast Digest, you are a hardcore podcast listener, and it takes a lot to hear something that you haven't heard before, at least in style and format. Chronicles Unwritten will definitely meet that bar in terms of something you haven't heard before. So definitely worth checking out, folks. So before I let you go, Dave, I want to kind of hop into some other non-Dave Meyer production topics, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
So you have been a friend and fan of the indie podcaster community for a long, long time. You mentioned that you have been to Rose City Comic Con, which was not a podcasting event per se, but you attended with a lot of other indie podcasters and got to meet a lot of folks in person and so on and so forth. I've heard you talk about this a couple of times, but not necessarily recently. And I'm curious, and maybe somebody who is listening is another big Dave Meyer fan. As we sit here now, approaching the end of 2015, what has this experience been like being a part of this really vibrant independent podcaster community?
You know, I wouldn't trade it for the world. Like there's so many good people out there, and sometimes I rant about technology, but I mean, it's allowed me to connect with just people I would have never have dreamed of. I mean, the fact that I got to get together with 15 something podcasters, in Portland is something I wouldn't have even thought about a year ago. And I remember telling my boss when I asked for the time off to go, and when I explained it to him, he's like, "So you're meeting a bunch of people you've never met in real life and hanging out with them for 3 days?" I'm like, "Yeah." And he thought I was completely crazy. But I think this community is just fantastic because we're all looking to do something, and we're all looking to do something together. And I just can't even put it to words. Like, it's crazy that we all become so friendly and we all become so close. And, we really, besides, helping each other, build shows, we're really building friendships. And that's why I truly have a big passion for this hobby.
I'm going to bet, and I think I can say this with a high degree of confidence, there's probably someone listening to this episode that is on the fence, that maybe has got a little bug in the back of their mind that says, maybe I could do this. Maybe I should start a show. What would you say, given your experience now as somebody who's been in it not super long, about as long as me, give or take, that has really taken to it? What would you tell that person?
I would just say, hit record, plain and simple. I know a lot of people, I spent a lot of time on Reddit and cruising the podcast forum. And a lot of people are like, yeah, we're thinking about it. We're not too sure, but just do it. Just pick a topic, what you want to talk about. Recording equipment is really cheap. I know, I think you had some links up to your site for that sort of stuff, didn't you, Dan?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. So you can literally get started for, like under $100.
Yeah.
And it's a great hobby. Everyone will help you out. And if you really try to reach out and give a little bit to the community, they will pay you back tenfold.
Can you try to explain the addiction? I've tried on a couple of different times, on a couple of different shows, a couple of different conversations I've had, because it's funny. I've got a handful of tattoos, right? And people talk about tattoos being addicting, right? Like after you get your first one, you're going to immediately want your second one. And you wouldn't think at first that it's kind of this leap, right? And that, but once you do, it ends up being something that you often think about and often want your next thing. I think podcasting is somewhat similar in a sense. What would you say about that once you took that leap and started recorded that first episode of Cool Story Show and put it out? I would imagine at that point, whether you knew it at that point or not, you were hooked, you were done, it was over. Tell folks about how kind of getting over that hump and what they can expect on the other side.
Well, one of my favorite analogies is the one that you used when you explained people to coming to a room to listen to you talk.
Yeah, I've said that so many times now.
Yeah,
I'm glad you liked it though.
Oh, it's one of my favorite analogies of all time because I don't want to butcher it, but like you said, if you have a conference and like 5 people show up to hear you talk, wouldn't that be flattering? And then 10 people, 20 people, and the list goes on and grows. But there's the one side of it where you release something and you're like, people are listening to this, really? In China? In Russia? Like in Alberta? This is crazy. So there's kind of I guess that self-gratifying thing of like, hey, people are liking what I'm doing and they're checking it out. And that kind of makes me keep wanting to do it. But besides that, it's more to me about, building friendships. It's about trying to produce, good quality content. And it's about just talking to people. I mean, a lot of times you don't see it too much now where people are always bent down on their phones. But I really think that people don't talk enough to one another. And, if I can take an hour out of my day and sit down, be it with you or anybody, and just have a conversation, I'll do it 9 times out of 10, because talking, I think, is a very important thing. And it's more or less something I think that people have gotten out of because of, cell phones and technology. But that's why this is such an addiction to me, is because I just love talking to people. And if I can spend any night or any time doing that, I'll always do it.
Do you think your views have changed a little bit? And now that you've put out so many episodes, you mentioned Podcasts Over Borders right around that 50 mark, but collectively amongst all your shows, you put out, I don't even know what that number would be, 80 to 100 episodes, but guest spots. I mean, you're all over the place at this point. Have your views changed at all? You use the word hobby, and I would still say the same about myself with the Podcast Digest. This is still my hobby. But I know for me personally, now 70 episodes in, I look at it a little bit differently. I put a little more seriousness on it. I have a little more care with what I do, a little more focus in what I'm doing than maybe I did at first. Do you feel the same after all these episodes, or do you kind of still have sort of the same mindset?
I think each is different. I think when I started, and that's not to say I don't take every show seriously that I do, but I think when we started Podcasts Without Borders, we started it to be, more serious. I mean, we were more worried about time limits and, and downloads and stuff like that. And then as it's progressed, it's just like, hey, let's sit down and talk to this guy and just have a good time. Ask any topics you want, talk about anything you want, and just having fun. With Diamond Mines, it's more so Dad always bugs me about making sure I have the jokes because I don't come prepared. But with that one, it's just getting to hang out with Dad. And, if we get to talk to people, then we do. And if not, I just enjoy having a conversation with him. But then I think with my new show, I think it's because it's something that I'm writing and throwing out there. I'm kind of more meticulous about like looking over it, checking it, making sure that, the audio is good, quality is good, and, really polishing that up because, I really see this, being a very good thing. But everything else, like I said, is just a different facet of me, having fun or spending time with my dad. And I think one thing that's really changed for me is I've kind of stopped caring about, like the amount of listeners that I have or, worrying about downloads per month. It's just like, hey, you know what? I'm having fun. Let's just do it and not worry about, how many people are listening. Let's just put it out there and more do it for, like the people who are and for myself. And I'd really say that kind of wraps up my current views on such things.
And that's why I was sort of asking in that I sort of look at Chronicles Unwritten as an evolution, right? Chronicles Unwritten wasn't possible a year ago. Is that safe to say?
Oh, absolutely not.
Right. And it's your experience in the podcasting world. It's your expertise that you've acquired over time, whether it be from production, whether it be from your the connections you've built with people like Tristan or other potential narrators in mind, or feedback from an established audience of listeners, that this wouldn't have been possible. And I think that's sort of the source of my question, that do you feel now that you're in a little bit different place that has sort of empowered you or enabled you to put something like this out into the world? Because like you said, I don't know that you would have done this a year ago.
Well, I think I'm more fearless. Like I'm not really worried too much about, what people think. Like doing more about what I want to do. And you're right. Like I've learned a lot. I've learned how to be more comfortable on a mic. I've learned to, do a lot of audio stuff. I mean, it's come a long way since, just plugging something in and hitting record, you have to worry about a lot more things. But all these connections that I've made and all the things that I've learned, I think have come to me deciding to do Chronicles Unwritten, because now I think I've got the talent and the ability to produce something that I think a lot of people are going to enjoy that I would not have been able to do before.
So do you think that is something that person who's on the fence listening to this could or should maybe keep in the back of their mind, that if they are willing to put in sort of that time, that effort, that work, that maybe they could attempt to take on something as, I mean, let's be honest, this is an ambitious project that you've undertaken. You, like you said, you've sort of made yourself accountable to a timeline, to a result, to a production process that you may not have susceptible yourself to 6 or 8 or 10 months ago. Is that possible for that person thinking of starting now?
I think so. I think that anybody starting has to learn and grow from what they're doing. But I think ultimately what they learn and grow for, they will produce awesome things. And I guarantee you that if people, start and take this journey from me, it'll be one that they'll enjoy and they'll remember, because instead of just, being a listener, you can become part of the story. And that's absolutely why I love this.
So a couple other topics here, Dave. One of the things that I think that folks have talked about ad nauseum, and it's sort of toned down the last couple of months, but I'm interested in broaching this again with you only because I wonder if you are at sort of a transition point of this concept of independent podcaster, right? And if I do not mention Neil and Annalise from Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks, it would not be a podcast with Dave Maier. But I know Neil has espoused several ideas on independent podcasters, as have Grant from Stranger Conversations and others. And I know Grant has actually told me several different times that he's kind of evolved his views from a few of my rants on the topic. But one of the things that have started to cross my mind, or I've started to look more seriously at, are taking my game to the next level, if you will. So I've actually looked at and considered and wondered about things like podcaster conferences, right? Podcast Movement's a huge one. It's in Chicago next year, and there are many other, smaller, localized podcaster conferences that could potentially help exponentially grow things like networking and meeting those people who can help with this, that, or the other, and so on and so forth. Where are you, Dave, with the idea of taking all that you've acquired and all that you've learned and all that you've grown to consider some of these next level ideas?
I think when you podcast, you kind of have to decide what you're getting into it for, and that may change as you start recording your shows. But from how long I've been doing it, I feel like I'm still kind of young in the sense that I need to establish maybe more work before I'd consider going to maybe a conference and maybe trying to go at it. I use the term professionally, but I just mean it in a sense where you pursue it for more than maybe just a hobby per se. And I don't think there's anything wrong with people aspiring to try to make a living or to try to make more of themselves through podcasting. Because as we joked around before we started recording, if we got paid to do this, I'd definitely do this all the time because it's absolutely amazing. But if you want to pursue that, I think then you do have to go to the conferences, and you have to get, make connections and try to do different things with your show to make it more successful. But it all depends on what successful is to you as a person. Like if you just enjoy hanging out with your friends and just throwing it up on the internet, and maybe, your buddies listen to it or others and you're enjoying it, then, good to you. But if you aspire to take it to the next level and get it, more notice, then I think you should definitely pursue it. Absolutely. And I definitely think you should pursue it, Dan.
But what about you? I mean, is there an itch in the back of your mind that wonders, should I, would I be successful? And I think I said in one tweet to you way back when Chronicles Unwritten was just a seed at that point. What if this gets featured in iTunes New and Noteworthy? What if I know you're not focused on stats, but what if one day you log in and there's 10,000 downloads overnight? What if something like that were to happen? Well, how would you react?
I would be pleasantly surprised. I'd be extremely thankful that so many people tune in and enjoy the show. I think I'd still maybe keep business as usual. I think maybe with the show I'd try to, I wouldn't necessarily say do more with it, but I'd try to definitely try to maybe push it if it is getting that popular. But I think it's hard to say. It's like anybody who has overnight success, all of a sudden you have it and you kind of don't know what to do with it. But I'm just trying to take the journey one podcast at a time, and just making sure that you're enjoying what I'm doing. And if I get there, I get there. And I guess I'll have to deal with that if that day did ever come, which would be cool. But I'm always thankful for whoever listens, and I really like putting out shows for the people that do.
Well, I think for one, it's a super interesting concept to talk about, because I think what you're doing with the show is super unique. I think it's unique to the marketplace at this point. I don't think this is happening out there, or at least I'm not aware of it again. And I think that this is just a question of people discovering it. And I have a feeling if people do, that there is potential. I remember, just to bring up our old friends again, a couple things. I was very fortunate to kind of get on them fairly early, and bring them on the Podcast Digest way back when. And I remember telling them way back when I first talked to them that they are going to explode, that they're going to grow, that they are on to something that I think as more and more people find out about it and discover it, that this thing will kind of blow up in their face, so to speak. I spoke to them back on June 7th, episode 42, for folks who may have recently come by the show and not heard from those folks over a couple things. Highly recommended. Check those guys out. But what's interesting is that I think we are starting to see that with them. They recently passed 1,000 followers on Twitter, and I think they are getting more and more and more publicity and more attention, as I'm so happy to see, because I think they deserve it. But what's interesting, Dave, is I think that you're very much in the same boat. There's no doubt you've got the itch. There's no doubt you've got the addiction. And now to see you branching off into a truly creative venture, I almost think that this is just like this, this spark just waiting to turn into like this huge fire. And I'm just kind of curious, if that happened, kind of how you would react or what you would do.
Well, like I said, I just do not know what I would do. I don't know, maybe buy some champagne. But
it's a good idea. We're all for champagne.
What would you do? I'm sorry, I don't want to turn it around like that episode that you did yourself on, but what would you do kind of quickly if you want to share if that happened to you?
Absolutely. No, I don't know. Go with it. But I think like you had explained, Dave, we all come at this thing with sort of a little bit different reason. I come at this from a DJ background, right? I have spent over 16 years standing on a stage with a microphone in my hand in front of a crowd. And I get more and more hyped the more and more people that are in that crowd. One of the regular questions I have for all the brides and grooms I speak to in advance of performing at their wedding is, what's your head count at? And I would be a liar if I told you that when they said 300, that I get a little more hyped for that show as if they said 50. Because that means that there is potential there for something really, really special to happen. Not that something special couldn't happen with 50 people, but you obviously boost your odds of a really special night, a really special party, if there's 6 times as many people there. And I think something similar there with podcasting as well. I've been very, very fortunate and lucky to have been joined by a number of excellent guests. I'm humbled just by looking at my my back playlist here, my back catalog. And when I put one of those out to the world, I sit back and think, I just had a conversation with this person. And if I hadn't done the show or started the show, I never would have been able to do that. And for me, the idea of an overnight blow up means that I would be empowered to have more of those conversations. Kind of like you were talking about with Podcasts Without Borders, is that this idea of just bringing this person in and having a conversation with them and having that value in speaking to people. I have spent 6 or 7 or 8 years as an avid podcast listener, and I've been so fortunate to have been able to have a number of the guests that I was listening to 7, 8 years ago, just by myself when I was, a single guy and life was so much simpler. And I remember just walking around a community college campus with earbuds in and listening to these hosts. I've actually had a chance to now talk to a couple of those, and that has been amazing to me. These people I've spent literally hundreds of hours listening to in my ears, and then being able to talk to. So the idea of an overnight blow up to me means basically it's a currency that allows me to cash it in to be able to speak to even more of these people that I thought were outside of my realm, who would never, ever consider sitting down with me, and then the opportunity that they would spend an hour just talking to me. And that in and of itself is so valuable.
Wow, absolutely. That made me take my breath away a bit, Dan.
And it's just sort of my perspective, sort of kind of the way I look at it. It's just an enabler, to be able to. I say it a lot about DJing, that I've been fortunate enough to be able to say or go places and do things and experience things that I never would have been able to do, be it venues or working next to kind of pseudo-local celebrities, or being, I told the story when Harry Duran interviewed me where I introduced a band on stage at a concert venue in Norfolk, Virginia. If I hadn't been a DJ, I never would have been on that stage introducing a band at a concert. And I kind of look at podcasting the same way, that it's just a vehicle to potentially be able to do something that I've never done before. And that would completely excite me.
I think you couldn't have explained it better. I absolutely agree.
Well, and I think that so much of that is there, and I think that if you're able to bring along an Aaron Corbet or Paul Maier or a Tristan Boyle from a narration standpoint with Chronicles Unwritten, it's even would be that much more satisfying. Where you and Aaron were to bring on a guest and be able to have a conversation with them. And you've done that so many times with so many others that I think, you've probably felt a little bit of that already. But to be able to feel it even more so, I think would be awesome.
Absolutely. And I want to officially invite you to narrate a season.
Yeah, I mean,
it's recorded. It's on your show now.
Yeah, there you go. I guess I can't say that I never heard that, right?
Because I really like people who have really strong, awesome voices, and you're definitely one of them. So if I can convince you to narrate a season or maybe fill in a couple parts I have in mind, I would be absolutely honored.
Well, I'm always willing to help out. Diamond Dave in any way I possibly can. Like I said, I feel indebted from you being one of my first actual podcast host guests almost a year ago as we sit here now, and I'm willing to help in any way I can. So
I remember I sweated that whole interview. Like, literally. I had to hold my hands because they were shaking so hard.
Yeah, and then I nobody knew who in the world I am, and now only a couple people know who I am. But so. Well, Dave, I really appreciate you taking the time this evening and coming back for the third appearance. I believe that puts you in the lead. I think second place is going to be your good friend and mine, Molly, from Couple Things. She's at 2. So I think you've jumped ahead of Molly with this episode 70's appearance.
Well, I just cannot thank you enough for having me back on the show. It's just always a pleasure to sit down and talk with you and get featured on your program. I just can't explain really into words how awesome of a work you do, and just the quality of shows that you put out and all the people that you talk to. You're just really doing such an amazing job podcasting, and I really, really wish you all the best in whatever success you want to have from this, good sir.
Well, and I appreciate that very much, Dave, and the same to you as well. But before I let you go, I want you one more time run down this catalog, the website links, the Twitter handles, all the stuff folks will find in their show notes. Tell folks where they can find you.
Whew. Sorry, people. This is going to be a bit. So if you want to reach me, I'm at David Maier 7. My show Podcast Without Borders is at No Borders Pod. Diamond Minds is at Die Minds Pod, and Chronicles Unwritten is at Chronicles U. I'm currently playing around with changing the website. I might maybe make an umbrella for all our shows, kind of like a mini network in a way. So I don't currently have one. But yeah, just send me a tweet. I'd be very honored if anybody checked out any of those shows, and definitely check out more of Dan's show because it's fantastic.
Well, this is about going to jump over and add things to people's playlists. I'm hoping Podcast Digest is already there, but if Chronicles Unwritten or Diamond Mines or Podcast Without Borders is not already in your subscription list, at least try it, folks, right? Like I say, everything I recommend is not necessarily something for everybody, although I think it should be. But I understand different strokes for different folks, but at least give these a shot. And I have a feeling that, especially with those 3 shows, as Dave was explaining, it is a whole range of tastes. And all 3 of those shows, they're all very different products, if you will. But I am pretty darn sure that at least one of those will tickle your fancy. So, Dave Meyer, thank you for joining me on the Podcast Digest. Very much appreciated. And I have a feeling we'll be doing this again at some point in the not too distant future.
I will always clear my schedule to come hang out with you, Dan.
Well, thanks, Dave, again. And folks, that'll do it for episode 70 of the Podcast Digest. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, let me and let Dave know. Let us know on Twitter you enjoyed the episode. Share it with your friends. Review on iTunes or Stitcher doesn't hurt either. And folks, my name is Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest. That'll do it for this week, and I'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter @PodDigest Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.